Hello, I am Ben Pearson, the Roser Tracker, and the last few months have been very exciting when it's come to spacecraft visiting the International Space Station. So let's talk about all of the major comings that have happened. Now, all of this is centered around Starliner. Starliner is Boeing's spacecraft that is the counterpart to the Crew Dragon spacecraft that is designed to carry humans to the International Space Station. It was bid at the same time, and theoretically they were supposed to launch at the same time, although Boeing had some issues that we'll talk about later that led them to delaying the flight pretty continually. And even with this particular launch campaign, it was delayed. First, it was delayed for a issue with the rocket, which is actually pretty rare. The Atlas rocket is a very, very reliable rocket. It almost always launches on time. They had to delay the mission a couple of weeks to fix some valves or something like that that were a problem with the upper stage. But then Starliner started to have issues, and all of its issues have basically been with the helium system. Now, the helium system in most of these types of rockets is basically a pressurization gas. So they need to maintain a certain pressure to get the fuel outside of the nozzle. And so it's a couple of different ways you can do it, but basically you'll have the helium that is a pressure source that will put pressure on the gas tank to let the fuel go out. And there's been some of this that has been leaking. They noticed the leak first on the ground, but they decided that it wasn't that big of a deal. And then when it got to orbit, it became much, much worse. What was one leak became 5 or 6. And some of the thrusters, most importantly, stopped working while they were on their way to the International Space Station. They've since been able to test and figure out that all but one of them are still working, but they've had some issues, and quite frankly, NASA and Boeing have a disagreement as to what the severity, what the likelihood is that some kind of a serious issue would happen. But we don't really know, and it's really hard to know this kind of thing. So the spacecraft arrives at the space station, and at first all is well, but they decide to extend the mission for the first a couple of weeks at a time just to collect more data, because the part of the spacecraft that has all of these issues is not going to survive re-entry, so they really wanted to understand these while they were still there. And at first, I thought, hey, that's not that big of a deal. They're just trying to get more data. I didn't really think anything was coming of it. Now, there was a whole dialogue that was posted about the astronauts are stranded, and I want to make this clear. The astronauts are not really stranded, even today. If there was an emergency tonight and they needed to come home, they would come on one of the Starliner spacecraft and it would be fine. But they were still wanting to get the data, and there wasn't an emergency, so that way they could understand the problem better. Well, as they collected more data, there became more and more questions, and at some point in time, they started seriously discussing, hey, do we want to send these on a Crew Dragon, these astronauts home on a Crew Dragon mission? Because that is actually an option. This is not something that has ever been an option before. The only other option was Soyuz, and even then, that's not something that was very seriously considered. During the space shuttle era, that was a possibility, but it's not something that was really that seriously considered. We have these astronauts that are on the space station. There's 2 extra astronauts, and the normal compartment is 7, I believe. So they're, using a fair bit more, and it's now into September, so it's been 3 months that they've been stranded. Well, part of the way through there, Falcon 9 had one of its very rare failures. They had an upper stage engine that was leaking a little bit of oxidizer, and it failed to relight. And it was with the Starlink mission, so the only customer payloads that were affected were Starlink satellites, and they've had hundreds of these successful in a row. It's a very, very reliable rocket, even today. But they had to drop off the Starlink satellites in a lower orbit, and None of them were able to survive, unfortunately. SpaceX has done that once before, although this was a secondary mission. They dropped off the Orbcomm satellite into a lower orbit when they first delivered cargo to the International Space Station. So this was way back CRS-1. They've now gotten to the 20s, and yeah, it's been a little while. So we have 3 different American ways that will carry cargo to the space station. We'll talk about those in a second. Then we have the Progress spacecraft, that is the Russian one that delivers cargo on a regular basis. And we have had a couple from Europe and from Japan in the past that have carried cargo to the space station, although I don't believe they're currently active. So the 3 American ones are the Cygnus spacecraft that is launched on the Antares rocket nominally, but the Antares rocket had this really kind of nasty issue where the rocket body was built in Ukraine and the engines were built in Russia. I think it's pretty safe to say that rocket's never going to fly again. We have the SpaceX Dragon that it will carry cargo. It's launched on a Falcon 9. The Cygnus spacecraft, because they can't launch on the Antares, is also launching on a Falcon 9. And then there's a 3rd spacecraft that is launching, which is the Dream Chaser, which is this little cool space plane. And it will launch someday to the space station, but they're having some issues getting it integrated. It's going to launch on the Vulcan rocket. It was supposed to launch on the 2nd launch of the Vulcan rocket, which is now supposed to happen sometime this month of September 2024. And once that goes, it should be pretty neat. But, you know, there are all of these issues that have happened. Okay. So what does all of this actually mean? Well, you can't launch Dream Chaser because the spacecraft's not ready. Falcon 9 was grounded after this for a couple of weeks, and that meant you couldn't launch the cargo to the space station. You couldn't launch new crew to the space station. Now, if there was an emergency, yeah, they probably could have done something, but there was no way that was in American hands to get to the International Space Station for a very brief period of time. This is why we need this kind of redundancy. It's very, very important to have multiple ways to get there so you can maintain the space station. And NASA's learned the lesson. That's part of why they have the Starliner and the Crew Dragon, both of which receive some money. So that way, if there's an issue with one, they can still get to the space station. Very, very important. As time goes on, it becomes more and more evident that Starliner has a major issue. And they started to talk about the alternative architecture. And the alternative architecture is just, it's kind of insane. So this is actually what is going to happen. And we have some dates for some of this stuff. But the first step is they have to convert the Crew Dragon that is currently on the International Space Station to allow the astronauts to strap themselves to the bottom of the spacecraft so they have a way to get off of the space station in the event of an emergency. You always want to have a way home, even if it's a less than desirable. So they're going to configure this up so that way they could get home there in the event of an emergency. And then they're going to send Starliner home. They need that extra docking port. Then I believe, I'm almost positive this is the case, they're going to take the Crew Dragon that is on the International Space Station, and they're going to move it to a different docking port, which means that all 4 primary astronauts that are in there, plus the 2 astronauts that are the backups, will have to be lying on their back while they're doing this maneuver. It should only last for a few minutes, but they're still going to do it, and they actually don't have any kind of spacesuit, which is compatible with the Crew Dragon. So it's a little bit unfortunate if that's the case. Still, this kind of stuff happens. Although it's pretty new. And the Crew Dragon, and for that matter Starliner, were both originally built to allow for 7 astronauts to be on board. They changed the orientation of the seats at some point in time for both of them, so that way they had a better G loading. But they still have the volume for 7 if they needed it. After then, it gets to the new port, then they're going to launch the Crew 9 mission. It's going to have 2 empty seats, and it's going to have the spacesuits for these astronauts. So that way they can return home safely. And then they will continue for the 6-month mission and return home in about March. So they'll have been on the space station for 9 months instead of the original 8 days. Astronauts usually don't complain about getting more time in space, though, so I think it's fine. There were a couple of astronauts that are getting booted from the Crew 9 mission, unfortunately. One of the big issues, as mentioned, is the spacesuits. The spacesuits that they do, but I think Boeing does this, and I'm positive that SpaceX does this. They have basically custom-built suits, so they will go and very, very carefully measure the astronauts so that they can have a spacesuit that fits them perfectly, and they are all custom made. But SpaceX keeps the vast majority of their spacesuits in storage just for this kind of situation. So as soon as it became evident that this was a possibility, they looked through all of their spacesuits according to the astronauts' measurements, and they found some that are close enough that they'll be fine through reentry. So they're going to send those up. My guess is that Starliner is going to be perfectly fine. I anticipate that it is going to return home on September 6th or, within a week of that time. And there's not going to be any major issues during it. See, the dialogue has been going around that they're stranded. They're not really stranded. Starliner is relatively safe. If the International Space Station was blowing up, it would certainly be safer than staying on there. Or if there was a medical emergency or something like that. My guess is it has a single-digit percentage chance of failure, which that seems crazy high. If you were going to hop in an airplane that had a single-digit percentage chance of failure, I would probably get off that airplane, to be honest. A 1% chance of death doesn't seem worth it to fly. But going into space is inherently dangerous, and NASA has set the threshold at 1 in 270 for the crew safety for these commercial crew missions. So there's a 1 in 270 chance. So if there's a 1% chance, then, that's a little bit more than twice the risk that they would be for a nominal mission. But this was a test mission. You go into that knowing that there's a higher risk than normal, and it's just kind of expected. But the Starliner, if it was closer to 10%, nobody's going to get on that. Like, even the Mercury astronauts, I don't think would get on with a 10% chance of failure if they knew that was the case. And the truth is we just don't really know. I think if they had a number that they were confident in, they would do it. Boeing thinks it is more likely to work better. NASA thinks it's less likely to work better. And time will tell. I mean, if the spacecraft comes home and there's a massive catastrophe, well, it's going to be really, really, really bad for Boeing. They're already in kind of looked down on, and it would just pile on even more. But I don't really think that's going to happen. These guys, they know what the risks are, and they're taking the steps that they need to fix them. The bottom line is Starliner is a relatively safe spacecraft, and they're going to figure this out, and they are going to get their ducks in a row. Boeing does know what they're doing, despite common perception, and I don't really fault them at all for these failures. These kind of thruster failures, they happen on a lot of spacecraft. It's the kind of thing that you can only really test when you're in space. Granted, they did detect a leak on the ground, but they didn't think it was that big of a deal on the ground. Maybe they should have taken it a little bit more seriously, but you do what you can. The one failure I do fault Boeing, by the way, is their first launch. Their first launch had basically a failure to properly test everything on the ground. If they had tested everything on the ground, they would have identified 2 of the 3 biggest issues, namely that the clocks were off, which caused the mission to not actually properly orbit. They had to go into a backup mode, and they found out at the very last minute that they had the wrong configuration for the thrusters during the final reentry part, which could have caused an issue, hypothetically. But we'll never know. They've managed to patch the software in an emergency patch in 2 days, which is absolutely insane to a person who's tested software. But they were able to do it, and it worked out. Now, the comm issues and most of the other issues they had, that's the kind of common stuff that you find on orbit. And you're just not really going to know until you can test it there. SpaceX had the advantage that a lot of their stuff they could test with the Crew Dragon, and their first Crew Dragon didn't even attempt to dock with the International Space Station. It was just kind of a boilerplate. It also launched on the first launch of the Falcon 9 rocket. So they were testing everything all together, but they've had the recent experience with this kind of stuff, and yes, Crew Dragon is a fair bit of an upgrade over the original Cargo Dragon, but still, they're making some headway there, and they've had a lot more recent experience. But Boeing has their experience too, right? Anyways, the bottom line is I hope that Starliner manages to make it home safely. I hope that Boeing learns everything they need to keep this issue from happening, and I applaud that NASA is actually working to figure out these issues while they still have the opportunity. And this is a huge safety type of thing. If NASA had done some of this kind of testing and this level of detail with some of the previous issues that they had, we may have had some astronauts that passed away that would still be alive today. So good on you, NASA, for taking this seriously and making the hard call. Either way, it was a hard call. I'm glad I didn't have to be a part of it. Thank you guys so much for everything. I appreciate all you do. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have. Until next time, keep on tracking and take care. We will see you then. Bye-bye.